Leeds Castle, the ladies' castle of England.
I'm at Leeds Castle. It's been called the loveliest castle in England, and it certainly lives up to the name. The elegant stone keep, towers and crenelated battlements, surrounded by a tranquil moat, beautiful gardens, and lush parkland are exactly what you would picture as an idealized medieval castle. Leeds is also England's ladies' castle. Over the centuries, it has often been strong women who have owned, enjoyed, protected, and renovated this place. It's been a holiday retreat to generations of medieval queens, the site of a deadly skirmish between two great ladies, the literal place of conception of the Tudor dynasty, a prison for two accused royal witches, and a playground for English aristocracy and Hollywood stars. Let's explore Leeds Castle and its scandalous history.
Leeds Castle is not near the city of Leeds in Yorkshire in the north of England, as you might expect, but in Kent, southeast of London. It was named for a Saxon chief called Lead. In 857, he built a wooden structure here on two islands in the middle of the River Len. After the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror ordered a great survey of his new kingdom called the Domesday Book. It recorded an estate called Leeds, owned by the king's half-brother, Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. William's son, William II, Rufus, disliked his uncle. When it was discovered that Odo was conspiring to invade Italy and make himself pope, his nephew ordered his arrest. The king seized Leeds Castle and granted it to a loyal knight, Robert du Crèvecoeur, or Robert the Broken-Hearted. His family built a stone moat and bailey castle. The keep was on the smaller island, and the walled domestic buildings, or bailey, that supported everyday life were located on the larger island. The two islands were linked by a drawbridge, which could be pulled up to protect the keep if the castle was under attack. And attacked it was during the Anarchy in 1139. When King Henry I died, he left the throne to his only surviving child, his daughter Matilda. But few thought a woman could rule, so her cousin, Stephen of Blois, invaded and a civil war ensued. The du Crèvecoeur family supported Matilda, marking the first time the castle stood on the feminine side of history. The family managed to survive a siege and retain ownership of their castle. Matilda was not so lucky and was overthrown by Stephen.
In 1278, Leeds Castle was purchased by Edward I's wife, Eleanor of Castile. She invested heavily and ordered the royal architects to transform it into a lovely and comfortable holiday home.
The well-educated and stylish Spanish queen adored the Arthurian legends and songs of the troubadours. She was a wealthy property magnate in her own right. She ordered the construction of a new tower, which she called the Gloriette, the name of a fantasy tower in a 12th century romantic poem. In it, she built a banqueting hall, a chapel, and sumptuous royal apartments. Eleanor imported many Spanish luxuries she'd grown up with. She had glazed windows, carpets to warm the cold stone floors, and forks at her table. She scandalized the English with her opulence. Unlike many English nobles, Eleanor was fond of bathing. She ordered the construction of a bathhouse with tiled walls and piped-in water. Her husband, who had taken to bathing during his time on crusade, often joined her there. But this was still the Middle Ages, and the castle needed to be defensible. Eleanor ordered a lake surrounding the castle to be dug out by hand, and the river was diverted to fill it. Thus, the castle was protected by water on all sides. Edward and Eleanor were devoted to one another. He was a famous warrior king, brutal towards the Welsh and the Scots, but tender and loving with his family. As he traveled around Britain waging war, Eleanor was always by his side, and they must have gotten along well because she gave birth to 16 children.
Eleanor gave birth all over England. There's no record of her delivering a child here at Leeds, but it's likely that several of the princes and princesses were conceived here while the couple were relaxing away from battle.
Being pregnant for most of her adult life seriously compromised Eleanor's health. While on the march in northern England, she contracted malaria. Her body was too weak to fight the disease, and she died at 48, surrounded by her husband and children. The heartbroken king ordered the construction of 12 elaborate stone crosses to mark her funeral procession. Only one of he and Eleanor's sons survived childhood. In order to secure the succession and improve relations with France, King Edward married Philip IV's sister, Margaret. He was 62 and she 20. Still, they had a happy union. They enjoyed listening to minstrels, playing chess, and visiting Leeds Castle.
They honeymooned here, and Edward gave Margaret the castle as part of her dower lands, meaning she could use it to support herself even after the king died.
Margaret had a calming influence on the increasingly cantankerous king, and often intervened in his arguments with his son. She had 3 children before King Edward died at 68. The 26-year-old widow never remarried. She remarked, "When Edward died, all men died for me." When she died at 38, Leeds reverted back to the crown. Edward II was one of England's least popular kings. He was hated for his incompetence, blistering defeat against the Scots, and his blatant favoritism towards his lover, Piers Gaveston. He cared very little for his wife, Isabella of France, and did not give her Leeds Castle. Instead, he handed it to a loyal courtier, Baron Battlesmere. Isabella had little choice but to endure her husband's neglect and humiliation. She stuck by him even when his barons revolted. They captured Gaveston, ran him through with swords, and beheaded him. But the king soon found a new favorite, Hugh Despenser, who manipulated him into going on an ill-advised revenge campaign against the barons. Battlesmere switched sides and joined the rebellion against the king.
He rode off and left Leeds Castle under the command of his wife Margaret and told her to defend it at all cost. Edward wanted the castle back, but he sent his wife Isabella to do his dirty work. She rode up to the gates and demanded that Lady Battlesmere let her in. The queen said that she'd been on a pilgrimage to nearby Canterbury Cathedral. But as pilgrims don't usually travel with armed guards, Margaret wasn't fooled. She refused to let the queen in. An act of treason.
During the tense standoff, soldiers within the castle fired arrows at the queen. Several of her men were killed, and Isabella rode away to safety. This was just what King Edward wanted. Now he had an excuse to march his army to Leeds and put the castle under siege. After a week, Lady Margaret surrendered. 13 of her men were executed on the spot, and she and her children were imprisoned at the Tower of London. Sir Battlesmere was captured, dragged through the streets of Canterbury, hanged, and beheaded. King Edward's schemes put Queen Isabella in mortal danger a second time during a campaign in Scotland. When she finally made her way back to England, not only did her husband refuse to apologize, but he demanded that she swear loyalty to Despenser. When she refused, he confiscated her property, arrested her servants, and took her children from her. This was the last straw. Isabella went home to France and returned with 100 ships filled with soldiers. Her army captured Hugh Despenser. He was publicly hanged, disemboweled, castrated, and beheaded. King Edward II was captured and imprisoned, and then quietly murdered. Isabella placed her 13-year-old son, Edward III, on the throne, and she finally claimed Leeds Castle for herself and enjoyed it until her death at the age of 66. When Leeds passed to her son, Edward III, he didn't give it to his wife, Philippa of Hainault. He kept it and added 2 portcullises, a new drawbridge, and refurbished the royal apartments. His grandson, Richard II, did follow tradition and granted Leeds to his bride, Anne of Bohemia. When she arrived in England at 15, she spent Christmas at Leeds before her spring wedding. Once married, the couple visited the castle often. Together, Richard and Anne ruled over a sophisticated court of art, music, and literature. They forged a close bond, though Richard was attracted to men. Anne was popular with the people despite never giving birth to an heir, but she died of bubonic plague at just 28. Richard mourned her deeply and ordered a double tomb depicting them holding hands. He returned often to Leeds, the site of so many happy memories. Richard was overthrown by his cousin, Henry IV. He granted Leeds Castle to his second bride, Joan of Navarre, as a wedding present. When the king died, Joan retained Leeds as part of her dower. Her stepson, Henry V, was now on the throne. His focus was the ruinously expensive 100 Years' War with France, and he was desperate to raise funds. So he accused Joan of plotting his murder through witchcraft and necromancy. The king seized her wealth and lands and added them to his war coffers. Joan never even stood trial. If she had and been acquitted, Henry would have had to give back all her money. Instead, he kept her locked up in her own home at Leeds Castle. Her prison was luxurious. She had a retinue of servants, rode horses on the grounds, and had plenty of guests over for lavish dinners and entertainment. But when Henry V died of dysentery, Joan's properties were returned to her, and she left her prison at Leeds and spent the rest of her life at other castles. Leeds went next to Henry V's young widow, Catherine of Valois. She was the mother of the 9-month-old king, Henry VI. At only 21, Catherine was still beautiful and marriageable, a source of concern to her brother-in-law, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. As he was next in line to the throne, he didn't want any children of Catherine's getting in his way. The Dowager Queen fell in love with the Count of Mortain, and the pair wanted to wed. But Humphrey opposed the match and passed a law that any man who married the Dowager Queen without royal permission would forfeit his title and property. With his wealth on the line, Mortain lost interest. Barred from marrying a nobleman, Catherine began a relationship with her butler, Welshman Owen Tudor.
The couple had to conduct their relationship in private away from the disapproving court, and they spent much of their time alone here at Leeds Castle.
Their eldest son, Edmund, was the father of Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty.
So it's likely that one of the greatest dynasties in English history, the Tudors, was conceived right here at Leeds Castle.
She and Owen had 6 children. There is no record of the pair having been married, but their descendants claimed that they were wed secretly. Catherine died in childbirth at just 35. During Catherine's ownership of Leeds Castle, another royal woman accused of witchcraft was held prisoner here. Eleanor Cobham was a minor noblewoman, but she was beautiful and ambitious. She was a lady-in-waiting to Jacqueline Dunod, the wife of Henry V's younger brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Eleanor became the prince's mistress, and he divorced his wife to marry her. Humphrey became regent and effective ruler of England. Eleanor played the part of queen. And until the infant king had a son of his own, Humphrey was next in line to become the actual king. Curious about a potential meteoric rise in their future, Eleanor visited noted astrologers Thomas Southwell and Roger Bolingbroke to get her fortune told. In the 15th century, astrology was tantamount to rocket science, so it was taken very seriously when they predicted that the now 19-year-old king would fall ill in July or August and die, making way for Humphrey to become king and Eleanor queen. When rumors of the prophecy reached the king, he was alarmed. He had his own astrologers assure him that no such calamity would come to pass, and he had Eleanor and her astrologers arrested on charges of treasonable necromancy. Eleanor was locked up in Leeds Castle awaiting trial. Next, she was accused of visiting a woman named Marjorie Jordmain, known as the Witch of Eye, who had given her a potion to help her conceive. The charges were likely exaggerated to censure Eleanor's ambitious husband. Southwell died in the Tower before his execution. Bolingbroke was not so lucky. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Marjorie was burnt at the stake. As a noblewoman, Eleanor got off relatively easily. She was forcibly divorced from her husband and stripped of all her titles and wealth. She was forced to walk barefoot through the streets of London as crowds jeered and humiliated her. She held a lit candle to signify her penance, a punishment usually reserved for sex workers. Finally, she was imprisoned for life at Beaumaris Castle in Wales. Henry VI's mental instability led to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, during which the Lancaster and York branches of the family fought viciously over the throne. The victor was Henry VII, whose tenuous claim through his grandmother, Catherine of Valois, plus his superior army, allowed him to claim the throne and launch the Tudor dynasty. He had little interest in Leeds Castle. He didn't want to highlight his ancestors' illegitimacy. However, his son, Henry VIII, saw the potential in the majestic castle. Henry loved a project and transformed Leeds from an ancient fortification to a modern royal palace. An upper floor was added to the gloriette, with a bedchamber and bathroom. Fireplaces were decorated with he and his new bride, Catherine of Aragon's royal arms, entwined in lovers' knots. The Maiden's Tower was built to house her ladies-in-waiting. The king and queen stayed at Leeds while on their way to France for the Field of Cloth of Gold, a summit between Henry and his French counterpart, Francis I. The then young and happy couple stayed in comfort at the newly renovated castle, while many of their entourage of 5,000 stayed at nearby inns or camped out in the fields. Of course, Henry and Catherine didn't remain happily married. Though she suffered several miscarriages, her only living child was a daughter, Mary. Henry looked back at what had happened to Matilda and decided that he had to have a son. So he divorced Catherine, splitting from the Catholic Church in the process. Henry went through a total of 6 wives, and as his love life became increasingly complicated, the tradition of granting Leeds Castle to the Queen fell by the wayside. Leeds fell out of royal hands when his son, Edward VI, granted it to Anthony St. Leger in thanks for subjugating a rebellion in Ireland. Without the royal coffers to pay for upkeep, Leeds fell into disrepair. The St. Leger family sold it to invest in one of Sir Walter Raleigh's voyages. Sir Robert Smythe demolished several medieval structures and built a Jacobean manor house. Smythe sold the property to the Culpeper family, who supported the parliamentarians during the Civil War. As Parliament won, Leeds was spared when many royalist castles were pulled down. But when the monarchy was restored by Charles II in 1660, the Culpepers were ruined. They sold up to a royalist cousin, whose wealth came from 5 million acres in Virginia. He leased the castle to the government to house Dutch prisoners of war. The inmates set fire to the gloriette, leaving a gaping hole in its side for nearly 200 years. Catherine Culpeper married Thomas, 5th Lord Fairfax, and Leeds was held by the Fairfaxes for several generations. Their son, Thomas, gave up the castle and the title to move to Virginia. He was the only English peer ever to do so. His brother Robert shored up the family fortune by marrying 2 successive heiresses. First, Martha Collins, a member of the Child banking dynasty, and then Dorothy Best, a brewery heiress. Robert had bad taste. He covered up the Jacobean house with wood and stucco to make it look like a medieval Gothic castle. One visitor remarked, "A more ruinous disfigurement was never perpetrated." Robert also laid out the surrounding parklands, which were better reviewed. Lord Fairfax bankrupted himself renovating rooms ahead of a royal visit from George III and Queen Charlotte. He ended up in a pauper's grave. For a century, the castle was left to molder. In 1821, Fynes Wycombe Martin inherited the property and had it surveyed. Most of the buildings were in ruins, and the Maiden's Tower was in danger of collapse. He demolished the Jacobean house and built a new castle in the Tudor style. The hole in the side of the gloriette was repaired, internal walls rebuilt, and the moat was cleared and cleaned. But saving Leeds Castle from ruin ruined Martin. When he died, his family sold the property to pay the death duties.
In 1925, the Honourable Olive Paget bought Leeds Castle. She was the daughter of an English baron and an American heiress.
Her mother, Pauline, was a member of the prominent Whitney family. Her ancestor, Eli Whitney, invented the cotton gin in 1793. Pauline was among the many dollar princesses who wed European noblemen, shoring up the cash-strapped British aristocracy with an infusion of American dollars. Olive was born in New York, educated in France, and served as a nurse during World War I. She had 2 daughters with her first husband. They divorced, and she was on her second husband when she moved into Leeds Castle. They split as well, and she wed number 3, Sir Adrian Bailey, 6th Baronet, from whom she derived the name she is best known by, Lady Bailey.
Olive spent the rest of her life and much of her fortune updating and maintaining Leeds Castle and turning it into a comfortable holiday home.
She worked with French interior designer Stéphane Bouton, who would later design the French rooms at the White House for Jacqueline Kennedy. Olive added in a swimming pool and built an aviary for her exotic bird collection. From her travels, she sent home llamas and zebras to roam the grounds.
The Baileys spent the week in London and came here to Leeds during the weekend to throw lavish country house parties.
Country house parties were where the aristocratic, wealthy, and famous went to cut loose away from the public eye. During the day, they played croquet or went hunting in the park. And at night, there was an air of hedonism as champagne was guzzled, jazz music played, romances began, and beds were swapped. In order for celebrities to feel free to indulge, they had to be sure of a discreet hostess like Lady Bailey. She welcomed a dazzling array of notable people, including members of the royal family, Edward, Prince of Wales, and his scandalous mistress, Wallis Simpson, his younger brother, the Duke of York, who would later become King George VI, and his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and the most glamorous members of the Windsor family, Prince George, Duke of Kent, who was a bisexual drug addict, and his chic wife, Princess Mariana of Greece and Denmark. Foreign royals made visits to the castle while in Britain, including 2 of Queen Victoria's granddaughters, Queen Marie of Romania and Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, plus Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, one of the few surviving members of the Romanov dynasty. Political movers and shakers were also found at Leeds, including future prime ministers Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, and the German ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop. It was revealed decades later that Ribbentrop had a secret affair with Wallis Simpson, some of which played out at Leeds. Lady Bailey loved the cinema, and she invited film stars to mingle with aristocrats, including Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who played Zorro, Frederick March, star of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, comedian Charlie Chaplin, Errol Flynn, best known for Robin Hood, romantic lead Robert Taylor, Jimmy Stewart, famous for The Philadelphia Story and It's a Wonderful Life, plus British stage actresses Gertrude Lawrence and Diana Napier, and French actress Lily Damita. Author Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, was a guest, as was American Woolworths heiress Barbara Hutton, for whom the term poor little rich girl was coined. Her scandalous love life saw her through 7 husbands, including 2 princes, a count, and American actor Cary Grant. One guest wrote of the scene at the castle, "We sunbathed, overate, drank champagne, and gossiped all day." But in 1939, World War II crashed the party. The moat was drained to prevent German bombers from spotting its reflection at night. The family moved into the gloriette, and the new castle was turned into a hospital for wounded soldiers. Badly burned men were sent here, where pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe reconstructed their faces. Those who benefited from his skills called themselves the Guinea Pig Club. By the end of the war, there were 649 members. Ironically, Lady Bailey allowed her friends in the War Department to test their new invention, petroleum flamethrowers, on the castle lawn. During demonstrations, admirals and generals were amazed and appalled. Churchill was impressed and sent thousands of the devastating new weapons to the front, where they would destroy the lives of young men on the other side. During the war, bombs struck the grounds, killing one of Lady Bailey's llamas, but the castle escaped unscathed. After VE Day, Olive reopened her castle to a few guests on a smaller scale. Queen Elizabeth and Princess Mariana visited often. Even in the 20th century, Leeds Castle was a vacation destination for queens. Lady Bailey died in 1974. She wanted to preserve her beloved Leeds Castle without bankrupting her children, so she created a charitable trust to maintain the castle in perpetuity.
It takes millions of pounds to maintain a historic place like Leeds, and since the fall of feudalism, aristocratic families rarely have that kind of cash laying around. But turning castles into profitable tourist attractions has become a new way to keep them going and preserve their history.
Leeds Castle now boasts a golf course, restaurant, and hotel where my mom and I enjoyed staying. During our visit in 2023, Leeds Castle has been restored to how it appeared during Lady Bailey's time. It still has the air and many artifacts of a medieval castle, but it feels like we've arrived right in the midst of one of her famous, elegant house parties.
I remember coming here to Leeds Castle as a child. My best memories are of the maze and shell grotto. I'm sure I imagined myself walking through as a great Tudor lady. Hedge mazes date back to the Renaissance, but this one was actually built in 1988 for the tourists. But inspiring a passion for history in young people like me seems a perfect fitting for a castle which has witnessed the lives of so many inspiring women.
Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. You can now follow History Tea Time on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. A special thank you goes to my patron, Justin Slater. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.